Let me get started. So welcome everybody. At about 12:25, we're going to go to questions from the audience. I want to thank Kim Seesink and her colleagues Erica Boyce and Pam Campbell for organizing today's program with Jonathan. Somebody's got your microphone on. Please turn it off. For now, I want to thank everybody for joining. Jonathan Reckford, for those of you who don't know him, has been CEO of Habitat for Humanity since 2005. He earned his MBA at Stanford, BA in Political Science from UNC. Worked at Goldman Sachs.
Hopefully so. Hopefully not an asteroid to get us all then.
No, small rock.
Okay.
Charles, you went on mute.
Actually, hit by a small rock.
How did I get muted? I gave you, you just got, it's the most brilliant introduction you've ever heard. One
It's amazing.
your parents would have loved and nobody gets to hear it. And I'm not going to read it again, except to say you got a distinguished career in the private sector before you joined Habitat for Humanity in 2005 as CEO. Did I miss anything?
Perfect.
Okay, that's it. All right, and so everybody, please keep your microphones off for now. And thanks for telling me. That would have been really pretty embarrassing. So, Jonathan, I maybe this is my flaw, but I think of Habitat as Jimmy Carter building houses. Is that right? Is there more to it than that?
That is right, though there is actually more to it as well. And President Carter turned 96 this week, and sadly, it's the first time in 36 years he has not been building with Habitat, which is one more casualty of COVID. One of the great myths is that he started and runs Habitat, which turned out not to be true. But there's no question that when he and Mrs. Carter got involved, they put Habitat on the map, and he is so deeply embedded and associated with us. The other big myth about Habitat is that we give away houses. And for those of you who have participated or engaged, I think one of the enduring things that has made Habitat successful is this idea of partnership, that families not only help build their homes and their neighbors' homes, but then pay back affordable mortgages that revolve in the community and help other families then have their opportunity to be able to purchase a home. The other big surprise, which for this audience particularly is relevant, is many people are not aware that the overwhelming majority, well over 95% of the families we serve are outside the U.S. Because we are so ubiquitous in communities in the United States. And
so here's a question for you. I mean, give me some numbers. I mean, do you have chapters, affiliates? How many chapters, affiliates do you have in the U.S. and around the world?
Yeah.
How many houses do you work on a year? I mean, what are your metrics?
So some of the key metrics: total revenue, if you add all the Habitat entities together, last year was about 2.3 billion. We have just under 1,200 affiliates in the United States that are almost like franchises. They do the local work, they raise money locally, and do the building and work with the families in the community. We operate in about 70 countries, and there we're much more involved. Habitat International, the umbrella group that I work for, does fundraising, advocacy, training, development, accountability, and support. And then we've also launched, which started probably 12 years ago, we started looking at how fast we were growing. And in terms of core metrics, our biggest metric had been how many houses could we build. And in 2005, we were helping about 125,000 people a year get new or improved housing.
Worldwide.
And we changed that framing question to what would it take to meaningfully reduce housing deficits in all the geographies that we serve, which is a much more audacious question. And that led us into both heavy policy and advocacy work, especially around property rights for marginalized groups and women around the world. And then second to what we call market development, but trying to reduce the barriers that stop families from improving their own housing. And so last year we helped about 7 million people worldwide get new or improved housing. And a lot of that has been through housing microfinance and through other market development mechanisms where we are opening up housing opportunities to families to be able to improve their own shelter.
When you go to Wikipedia, it says that Habitat is a Christian housing ministry. Is that accurate?
That is absolutely accurate. So we view ourselves, we are non-denominational, ecumenical, which is a word that's increasingly disappearing. And so we are not part of any one church, and we are not a religious organization legally. We are a 501c3 organization. And we have always, in many ways, the motivation of Habitat was to put God's love into action in a very tangible way in the world. But it's always been based on inclusion as well. And for those of you who don't know, the roots are in South Georgia. And the roots of Habitat were from a small farm called Koinonia Farm in next to Plains, between Plains and Americus, Georgia. And a pastor named Clarence Jordan, whose nephew was Ham Jordan, started an interracial farm in 1942. And you can imagine how welcome an interracial farm in South Georgia was in 1942. And he had a quite extraordinary combination of agriculture and Greek. And he wrote his own translation of the New Testament called the Cotton Patch Gospel. And he had a quote I just love. The farm always struggled. They were harassed and boycotted and shot at and bombed and not generally welcome. But he had a huge influence on many pastors around social justice. And in the 60s, he brought a group of people together to think about what could be next as the farm was struggling. And he wrote the most extraordinary letter after a week of that, and it really became the foundation. But they came up with the idea of partnership housing, and this idea of a fund for humanity, where there would be these revolving funds made available to sharecropping farmers, and they would come together almost like an Amish barn raising, build a home with them, and give them a no-interest $20,000 loan, which housing has gotten a little more expensive since then. And the families would pay back, and then in the spirit of community would continue to make payments after they paid that loan so that the fund would be sustainable. And Millard Fuller, who was an early social entrepreneur, came to sort of save his marriage to Koinonia, grabbed this idea and took it to Africa. And then the Fund for Humanity became Habitat for Humanity. And if you think about it, I think Clarence was so far ahead of his time in many ways, but he had an extraordinary, in this letter he said, what the poor need is not charity, but capital, not caseworkers, but co-workers. And what the rich need is a wise, honorable, and just way of divesting themselves of their overabundance. And
he's writing this in the 1940s.
The 1960s. So this was in the 60s. And so he was, in some ways, Habitat was a sort of early social entrepreneurship model before that was a well thought or known concept. And I think the spirit of that came along. And then to your question, it has always been a Christian mission, but always been one that included everyone. So the phrase that we've used for many years is God is our center, but not our border. So everyone is welcome. But the motivation for Habitat still comes from that idea of God's love in action. And the sort of methodology is bringing people together across all kinds of barriers. And I have personally built with blacks and whites in South Africa, and Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, and Muslims and Christians in Egypt, and Hindus and Muslims in India. And I have even had Democrats and Republicans build together. So it shows that
if you could do that, if you could do that, that is pretty extraordinary. My partner Laura was supposed to work on a Habitat back in March, but it was canceled due to COVID. So can you talk for a minute? I mean, have you shut down worldwide? How has COVID affected your work?
It has been a massive disruption. You know, we have faced natural disasters or man-made disasters all over the world at different times, but we've never had the whole world impacted by something like this. So we have certainly, like so many others, never faced this. It had a huge disruption, particularly on our volunteering. And the volunteers build a relatively tiny percentage of the homes that we help build or improve around the world, but it's critical to how we engage and enroll people for advocacy and raise funds. So it was a huge change. We stopped our international volunteering first and then our US volunteering. What has happened, and all of our retail stores shut down as well, but the stores reopened after a couple months with new safety protocols and are back. And we have about almost 1,000 Habitat for Humanity restores, some of you may be familiar with, and that's a key revenue source. And then
back up a minute. What do you sell at I don't know that. What is a Habitat for Humanity
This
store?
is a great hidden gem of Habitat. So it's another social enterprise. We take it's basically a thrift store for housing products.
Okay.
So if you were moving or remodeling, we would take anything that could be taken apart or taken out of the house. So we'll take the furniture, the appliances, the mantles, the cabinets, the doors, windows, toilets, everything, and resell those. And it's actually last year was over a $500 million business. That generated $140 million in sort of net revenue that can be reinvested in the mission. So, and the other thing is it kept over 200,000 tons last year out of landfills. So it's a really nice kind of triple bottom line social enterprise that supports the Habitat mission. But that is, so those are back, and as people are focusing on their homes, actually some have bounced back pretty well. The volunteer piece only, it's community by community. The international volunteering is still completely shut down for the rest of this calendar year at least. And the local volunteering is based on COVID conditions in the community, but mostly it's only the regular week in, week out skilled volunteers who are almost like extensions of staff who are able to come out and build. We're not accepting unskilled volunteers at this point, or the large teams for the great majority of our affiliates.
Is this your lawyers making you do this, or this is just you get together and you go, well, this does not make sense? Or
Yeah, no, it's really public health. I mean, the first thing we stopped was international volunteering because it was just inconceivable to us that we would inadvertently spread COVID to a vulnerable community somewhere in the world. So we wanted that. So this is really about protecting the communities first. And that's why our recommendation is at this point not to do volunteering, but there are rural affiliates that still have never seen a COVID case in their community, and they've marched right along in some cases. There are others who, have found, but generally most of the work that is going on now is completing existing projects, starting some projects, but working with contractors, professional staff, and again, in limited cases, skilled volunteers. But we aren't able to do the traditional volunteer work. And of course, that makes us very sad, but it's just we feel a responsibility to make sure we are following public health guidelines. It's interesting, construction is actually exempted in many places as an essential activity. So, and in fact, outdoor construction with good safety practices is relatively safe activity.
Yeah, you can hear some of the background from my house. My guy across the street's getting a new roof put on, so that's the noise. I think of COVID as a health and an economic crisis. I haven't considered it as a housing crisis. Can you talk about that for a few minutes?
Yeah, so Charles, what it has done is exacerbated an existing housing crisis, and in some ways it has just made it worse. So, globally, 1.8 billion people live in substandard or poverty housing, well over 1 billion in slums. And then in the US, we actually launched our first ever US Advocacy Campaign last year called Cost of Home, because there are 18 million families paying over half their income on housing. And so severely cost burden. And if you're doing that, you're making really heartbreaking choices about what not to spend. Then you can't afford either healthcare, you can't afford food, you can't afford other critical needs for your family. And so what's happened is COVID has just made that worse. I heard a phrase at the Fed board meeting a couple weeks ago that was new to me, but of a less than economy. So if you think of sort of the mathematical less than sign, the idea that we have a split economy. And for those of us who are knowledge workers, we can sit at home and do our work via video. And the market's been good, and jobs in many cases have been protected. And it's been inconvenient, but not so terrible. If you were a service worker or already living in poor housing, imagine if you didn't have a safe place in which to shelter right now. That's a health crisis as well as every other kind of crisis. And then you don't have a safe way to earn income unless you can be out. So that exacerbates it. So what really COVID is doing is adding to what was already a challenge. And so the way we've talked about it in the domestic scenario is, if you care about health, you have to care about housing. The correlations are extremely tight. And that would be true globally as well. If you care about racial equity in this whole conversation we've been having, clearly housing is probably the most dramatic example of systemic racism in terms of how housing was structured post-World War II. and how transportation was structured, and redlining and lending, and the federal government's role in that. So it really matters. And then the third side is on the economy. Actually, housing is one of the most efficient ways to create good paying jobs and create economic renewal. So we just did a session yesterday, which was actually World Habitat Day, the day the UN designates to focus on the need for shelter around the world. And we released a study done by Penn and another university, showing the economic multiplier of housing in low and middle income countries, that it's badly undercounted in terms of its contribution to GNP. And then in fact, residential housing contributes about 16% of GDP for low and middle income countries.
Okay, so, I mean, you've just described contradictory forces. Number one, if you're in the middle of this economic health crisis, housing is more important than ever. But on the other hand, because of the health crisis, you've had to scale back what you're actually doing. So how does that work? How do you square that?
Yeah, no, it creates urgency. So a couple of things we've done to shift. One is awareness. So it's a great time for advocacy. And so we have pushed people as they are sitting at home and maybe have a little more time to think about becoming more active as advocates and thinking about the policy frame. So how do we come out of this with better housing policies? The second is adaptation. And I've been really impressed. I was very nervous, back in March, that we might have to close down whole country programs and withdraw from places, and that this would be a huge financial crisis. Happily, donors have not backed off at all, which we're really grateful for. But also our country programs and our US affiliates have adapted. And so one of the fastest switches or shift in focus was we've always done water sanitation and hygiene, or WASH work, and we've greatly increased that work because for families living in informal settlements or in really poor housing conditions, it's really tough to stay safe from COVID if you don't have access to fresh water, if you don't have access to good sanitation. So that's been a primary focus along with training, and we've ramped that work up. And we've moved more to incremental housing, which is part of a broader trend versus starting big new housing projects, in terms of how do we upgrade and improve the conditions that people already are living in to help them be more resilient to the conditions that they're living in. So we won't release it till after our audits are all done. But for our fiscal year ended in June, at the end of June, we actually did much better than I would have anticipated, and the results will be, I think, surprisingly strong to everyone as they see how much we were able to do in spite of COVID. But it's not over, and there's no question. Many of our countries, Philippines is still under a large shutdown, which is a major program for us. Many countries are operating below what they could be doing if it weren't for COVID, and it's been. And there are some countries where they're not allowing any building to go on, so it's uneven as we go across the globe.
Where are you most active internationally? You mentioned the Philippines. Where else do you have the most affiliates, the most volunteers, the most work going on?
So Asia Pacific's our biggest region, which makes sense since 2/3 of the world and 2/3 of the world's poor are in that region. Latin America is second for us, and then Africa, then Eastern Europe, and then the anomaly for us is the U.S., where we have this massive footprint. Most of our work is in middle and low income contexts, but we do work in some high income contexts as well. And the truth is, there's housing need in all these places.
How has COVID changed your leadership style?
It's obviously, and we were talking before the session started, I have had to go, like everyone else, virtual. And I really miss being face-to-face with folks, being out in the communities, meeting the families, getting to be with donors and partners. And so that's been tough. I think it is, if you can bring good out of it, we have learned a lot about how to operate as a virtual organization. And as a global organization, that'll make us stronger on the other end of this. I think part of my title then also has to be encourager in chief. It is a time where people are stressed, and the longer this goes on, the more stresses there are, and things that we don't always think about. I think there's going to be increasing mental health challenges out in the communities we serve, but also among staff as this goes on. I have a huge empathy for our parents of young children who are navigating work plus schooling and childcare, for people who are living by themselves. I think loneliness was already a challenge in our world, and that's greatly exacerbated by this. So I think from a leadership perspective, my view has been no change in strategy, but we've got to be incredibly flexible in terms of our tactics, and in terms of making sure we are more than ever clear. Well, we can't promise our outcomes. We can't get rid of uncertainty for people, but what we can do is offer clarity around what we are trying to do and where we are headed. And I've focused very hard on that.
COVID's impacted my funding is that our donors, their businesses faced issues, and so they're backing off. How has that hit y'all?
Our donors have hung in remarkably, which I am sort of surprised and so grateful for, though it's uneven, just like the economy. So our corporate partners who are in the travel entertainment world have been badly hurt, and some retailers. Those who are in the digital space are thriving. So it is an uneven economy, and so some partners are doing great. Home Depot and Lowe's are big partners for us, and
they're doing real well.
Everybody works on fixing up their houses right now. So it's a mixed story, but I actually think that in some ways, as people are staying home, maybe that's made them more receptive both to the needs of those who are struggling in the COVID era, and as well just thinking about housing. We've always found it was hard to get people to care about housing. And one of my theories was that most of us have always had decent housing. And if you've never experienced the lack of it, you don't have a visceral understanding of what it is not to have it. If you meet somebody who grew up in poverty housing, they get it. And so I think now, where even middle-class families are seeing their own children struggle to afford housing, it's maybe been on the radar a little bit more over the last couple of years.
I asked the audience to get ready with questions, because we're going to start questions from the audience in a couple of minutes. What am I forgetting? What would you like to tell us about Habitat that I've not asked you? Is there something I'm just overlooking that I should be asking?
One of the coolest things about Habitat that would surprise people, that I get really excited about, is some of the market development work. And we created the Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter, and we set out well over a decade ago to try to convince the microfinance industry that they could for home improvement lending. And no one believed it. And we started lending our own capital to microfinance groups and training them to do housing lending. And it went well enough that we then raised a wholesale fund, took on debt for the first time ever, raised a $100 million fund called Microbuild. And it has been a huge success. And in fact, the home loan repayments have outperformed the small business loans for most of our partners.
Wow.
And we're now looking at a much bigger fund. And what's really exciting is, well beyond the $100 million we've put in, there have been hundreds of millions of additional dollars that have been invested by our partners as they've seen this as a viable opportunity. So we are now helping millions of people a year get small housing loans. And real success to me is that the market would adopt. And the next step in the value chain has been to help entrepreneurs come up with better building products for low-income families. So we've been doing shelter tech accelerators for housing entrepreneurs around the world, and those have now gone virtual. So we're able to keep doing those. And in fact, they're working really well in the virtual space, but we're giving training, mentorship, and investment to people coming up with better building products for really low-income families, or better building processes, and investing alongside and nurturing those investors. And we see great potential there. And then the last part is the policy side. And historically, though it's always been a principle, we stayed away more. But we recognize even if a woman in Bolivia has lived for decades or generations on property, if she has no legal right to be there, she doesn't have a financial asset, nor does she have the stability that would make it valid or rational for her to invest in upgrading her home. So we have put a huge push into establishing property rights, either through title or secure tenure, and as well as renter and other protections. And we've had some really significant policy wins that have helped another 25 million people around the world over the last 7 years have either property rights or other significant policy changes that allowed them to have better access to housing.
Does that mean that some of these loans for home improvement are collateralized, or are they? I mean, the
These are
traditional microfinance model is non-collateralized loans.
correct. And these are non-collateralized. So what we're seeing is often they go to families who may have already taken out a small business loan and established a little bit of credit. But we're also finding is there's such a hunger and lack of access to finance that people are really wary of missing a payment because it's in a way, a lifeline to be able to access credit. And so our repayment rates have been in the high 90s, which is quite extraordinary.
Wow, that's huge. That's phenomenal.
For we, you know, in the U.S. and in high income markets and in some middle income markets as well, we still do fully collateralized mortgages, but that's for a family that's got a more stable income and can afford to pay a still very low price, but pay an affordable mortgage.
Becky Carter, I'm going to put you on the spot. I want you to turn on your microphone, turn on your camera, and ask the question that you asked in chat.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Becky, nice to see you.
Good to see you too. I miss you guys. I was just looking at the calendar the other day and realizing that next month we would have been going on a build. So sorry,
Yeah, we were
we're
supposed to
not
be
doing
in the
that.
Dominican Republic this fall, and I hate that we are not going. Becky, you've been on some 15 at least of the Carter builds, it seems like.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know. I haven't counted. It's just such a wonderful, wonderful experience. And being a fundraiser with another organization that the Carters are involved with, known as the Carter Center, I will say what a terrible, terrible pattern Habitat has created in the world's population, in that everybody wants to do something that they can actually get their hands on when they volunteer with an organization. And so when people come to us and say, what can we do besides write you a check? We're lost when it comes to comparing ourselves to Habitat. So congratulations on that obviously very, very successful model. I'm just so glad to hear that things are continuing in some areas to make the progress that's needed in housing around the world. The question I asked was related to the WASH projects that you mentioned, and that basically was where are you working in WASH and how are you determining those locations, as well as how are those being funded?
And what does WASH mean?
Thanks, Becky. And WASH is water, sanitation, and hygiene. So it is, that's just a development acronym for that. And thanks for the comments and question. It is, and it's been interesting. We've been a little more bold in trying to think about why we have volunteers. And obviously we want to engage, but the reason we want to engage is ultimately to convert people so that they will help change policy and sort of change society over time. It's not really a construction strategy, though in fact volunteers work really hard and build houses. But I've led many teams to other parts of the world. And when I first joined Habitat, wondered if that was really a bunch of unskilled, wealthy people from, you know, the US or Europe or Asia to a place like Ethiopia or Cambodia. And what I've observed is actually it's transformational if it's done right, which is in the spirit of community and partnership. So it's really about education and learning. And if people come with the sort of a humble spirit that they don't really need our construction help as much as this is an opportunity to learn and build relationship, it can be deeply transformational. But in some ways, the great transformation is on the part of the volunteers. It's on the WASH side, we're doing quite widely. Asia is probably the largest, but also Africa. Right now, the programs that are the most active in terms of what we can do with COVID are Cambodia and Ethiopia are probably the two biggest programs right now. And then India, they're doing it in different ways. India's done it through more advocacy and coalition and partnerships, and then some of their own construction and their own financing, and they've raised money. In Cambodia and Ethiopia, it is more direct work where that they have shifted some of the house construction work into creating community water points and or connecting individual families to water and sanitation in both cases. And it is, funds have come from a mix of sources. We had In some cases, we've seen donors be quite flexible. So we had community development funds that were oriented towards projects, and we've gone to the donors and say, you know, until policies change at the government level, we can't do what we were going to do. Can we have the flexibility to do what the community needs most right now? We've seen quite a bit of donor flexibility, which is great. And we have then shifted some of our own unrestricted funding to help as well. And then we have seen some, we don't get a huge amount of foundation work, though we are working to get better on that, and multilateral institutional funding, but we have seen a lot of interest in the WASH space on the institutional funding side as well. And then we've seen some of our traditional corporate partners be willing to shift their resources as well, because that's been the most urgent need and some of the work that we could get done right now. And unfortunately, I think it's going to take a long time. I worry that in some ways next year, I worry about donor fatigue as this stretches on, and I worry about our ability to start new projects depending on conditions on the ground and sort of what the local communities are and aren't allowed to do. But we were already doing some amount of WASH. If you think about shelter broadly, the 5 core elements for us in shelter are that you have the legal right to stay on your property, that you have adequate living space per person, that it is durable for the risks and conditions in the community, and that you have access to fresh water and sanitation. So we view, if we want a family, we would consider a family properly housed when they had all 5 of those elements, but we would celebrate any one of those 5 as an incremental step towards proper housing.
Penny
Thank you.
Prime, thank you. Penny Prime, you had your hand up, although Jorge got asked type the question first. So Penny, I'm going to ask you to go next, if you'll unmute yourself. And
okay.
Hey, Penny.
Sorry, can you see me?
Yep.
And
Look
hear
great.
me? Okay, great. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much. It's just very interesting, and it's a really difficult time, but it sounds like the organization is really stepping up and morphing to make it work. I'm an economist, so I'm always interested in market development and market barriers. So I was very excited to hear about your market development side on the innovation and the access to credit. But let me ask you about the market barriers for a second.
Mm-hmm.
In the US, it seems like zoning and housing codes are 2 things, as being very inexperienced in this, but those are the kinds of things that seem to me to get in the way. And so I'm wondering, how much do those matter in the US in terms of your work, and how much do those matter in countries around the world?
It's huge, and they're different. Thank you for the question. The barriers are enormous. You know, if you pull back, and maybe I'll cheat them and split the 2. So if you're a family in Cambodia, you might have lived there forever, but not have the legal right to stay on your property. No one would give you a loan for housing, because banks would only serve the kind of A and B demographic in the country, and not the unbanked. So your only access to capital might be money lenders, or if you're lucky, family. And then third, even if you could get secure tenure and get a loan, your access to good quality building products or good information about skilled masons would be uneven at best. So the whole housing value chain doesn't necessarily work all that well. The zoning issues are real. It becomes more, in many places for us, it's about protecting the property rights, because you could easily get displaced and just pushed off your land if you don't have established property rights. And we've seen, or families who have lived in informal settlements. I was building at the outskirts of Colombia in Soacha, and these are families who had left the narco trafficking from this 30, 35, 40 years ago, but never gotten property rights. So if we can, by establishing the property rights in those communities, then you see the market start to work, because families will start investing and upgrading. And so I thought that Colombia was a really nice example, where what the government role was to establish property rights and improve transportation. And then the market started working, and the families could now have values on their homes, and you started seeing investment and the market start to work better. The US, you're exactly right. It's all about, we actually think we need change at the federal level, state level, and local
Local
level.
level.
Financing and subsidy is probably going to have to come at the federal and state level, because there are really no models in the world where anyone has solved housing without some degree of subsidy involved.
Mhm.
And we have a sort of, the math doesn't work today. If you're a good-hearted developer, and Habitat is certainly a good-hearted developer, and you want to build a house for a family that makes, even 2 minimum wage incomes, you can't acquire land and buy materials
do it.
and build a house that is actually affordable for that family without subsidy, either in the land or in the financing or somewhere in the mix. But on top of that is the zoning piece. And as many of you probably have read, the U.S. was organized in a way that was systemically inequitable. So specifically, to initially lock out blacks and Jews from huge swaths of our American cities, in a formal level, not just locally, but at the federal level. And then redlining followed behind that, in that federal housing loans went to safer neighborhoods, and those were designated by color, and that's where the term redlining came from. So what has happened is zoning has become now, when the passage of formal discrimination was made illegal, zoning became the informal answer to that, to keep out low and moderate income families from a huge number of neighborhoods. So if you looked, in Atlanta, I live in near Chastain Park. If you try to build, affordable apartments in our neighborhood, people will go to otherwise liberal-friendly people would go to the barricades. And we see that in every city in the United States, unfortunately.
Not in my backyard.
And so we have to build more. We have a huge supply problem in the US, but we know the right answer is mixed income, mixed use housing. And the Raj Chetty economic data is just so compelling in the US that if a low income child grows up in a mixed income neighborhood, it's not perfect, but the American dream still holds. Social mobility is pretty strong. For low income children who grow up in concentrated poverty, there's virtually no social mobility, and it takes a minor miracle. So, our view is we need to continue to invest in historically underinvested neighborhoods, but we also need to open up opportunity for families to move into neighborhoods with better schools, good transit, job opportunities, and everything else. And I think to me, just logically, we need more density where we have transit, because otherwise you end up with the situation we've seen in our hometown of Atlanta here.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Jorge Fernandez, you've got a question. Well, Jorge's getting on. I hope he's still on.
You might be on mute, Jorge.
It sounds
Oh,
got it.
There we go.
Okay, here we go.
Something happened to me that happens to you, Charles. I don't know how it got, but anyhow, here we are. My question is just sort of a segue to Penelope's question. You laid down the ground of the challenges, but as a Habitat, as an organization, do you get involved, if it's not at least on the policy side, with organizations that deal with affordable housing or with immigrants or refugee organizations similar to what's going on in DeKalb County, the IRC, and so forth and so on?
We do, Jorge, thanks for the question. We're very involved in broader partnerships. What we find is, because Habitat is sort of unique in the housing value chain, and that we do affordable home ownership, that a just arrived refugee family isn't in a great position right away to try to purchase a home. They need to get stable, they need to get acclimated, they need to build income, et cetera. But we have a significant percentage of our Habitat families come from refugee and immigrant communities once they have gotten settled and established. And so we are a little bit further down the chain. And we do, we are blessed with this very loved brand, and we've tried to lend more of that equity into partnerships. So I mentioned we launched our first national advocacy campaign last year in the US called Cost of Home. We've done a global one, and it had 4 real pillars that tie a little bit, and we want to do all this through partnerships. So the first pillar is to increase the supply and preservation of affordable homes, because we're actually going backwards right now. We have more affordable houses being upgraded and becoming unaffordable than we are creating new ones right now. The second is equitably increase access to credit, and that goes to some of the challenges both a historic of inequitable lending, and particularly communities of color. And so increasing policies for access to safe and sound credit is a big one. Optimizing land use goes back very much to Penelope's comments. And then finally, expanding and developing access to communities of opportunities, which I mentioned. So we are, all of those we are trying to do through partnership. I'll give just a couple examples that I think have gone well. We were deeply, in Habitat Minneapolis was deeply involved in the zoning changes. And this is, it's early, but a really powerful small change. Basically, what they said for the entire city of Minneapolis is that there could be no single family only zoning. Now, they couldn't be high rises everywhere without going through zoning boards, but anyone could now build duplex, triplex, or quad. And that's just a very soft way to densify, but that'll open up affordability, because land prices are such a big driver of why housing's not affordable. Austin, Texas, very similar, and Habitat helped drive that. In Oregon, there was a similar move for accessory dwelling units, which was another way to create some additional affordable units and slightly increased density. And we could go on. So we believe that the only way you can tackle these complex things is through partnership. And we recognize this slow, messy aspect of partnering, but we think it's the only way you ultimately get to
I guess everybody's got a role, but thank you very much, appreciate it.
Questions? Somebody just jump in. I got a couple. I mean, while we're waiting for somebody else to get ready, I just was listening today about unrest in Ethiopia, political unrest and curfews and all kinds of martial law. And what happened? You mentioned that as one of the countries where you're most active. How do you deal with political unrest in the countries where you act? I mean, you just back off and wait for things to calm down?
It's a great question. It is, you know, the strength in a way is, if you looked at the Habitat Ethiopia staff are all Ethiopians. So we are local, you know, in the country, which I think helps. And in some ways, it's always a judgment call on behalf of the local leadership team in conjunction with our regional leadership to figure out safety. Obviously, safety of our staff is a huge issue. So if I look at some of the places, because we're a development organization more than a humanitarian organization, we are not in war zones largely. So if it is like Congo, where you have long, deep violence, we had to withdraw there, and that's always a tragedy to me when we have to pull out. So we are no longer in Afghanistan. We're no longer in Congo. There are a number of places where we had to pull back, and that's always sad. But we are, you know, in many cases, able to keep working. Our Haiti team, I think, is just heroic, and they have managed to keep doing work even under really tough conditions right now. One of the tough dilemmas, which I know, Carter Center works with and many other NGOs are always struggling with, is what do you do if the government does not appear to be caring about its own citizens? And, you know, do you stay or do you go? How do you operate if with a very difficult government? Our general view is we are nonpartisan. We think even bad governments ought to have good housing policies, but we have to be very careful. So we don't typically take funding from governments that we wouldn't align with, but we still want to influence them if we can in a positive direction. But it's really difficult. We typically, in a place like Ethiopia, we try to stay sort of under the radar, and we obviously have to have the approval of the Ethiopian government to be able to work there. But we try just to keep on doing our work, and as we are able to, as long as it's safe for the staff and the families we're partnering with.
One last question.
Actually, Ambassador, I was wondering if Mr. Reckford can say a little bit about volunteering in Atlanta, how that's changed in the pandemic. Habitat was one of the first places I volunteered when I first moved to Atlanta, and I'd be interested to see how that's changed.
Yeah, thank you. And I never want to assert where things are. The really sad news is Atlanta Habitat is one of our shining affiliates, and they do an amazing job with volunteers. And they have had, like so many other affiliates, to stop most of their volunteering. I don't want to assert. So at this point, you can't just sign up to volunteer. it is possible they are that their regular high skill volunteers are coming out and doing projects who are almost like quasi staff, as I mentioned before. Don't know the answer. So we are eager to get to the point where it'll be safe to bring back out teams. And I think if those of you who want to volunteer, just keep checking. We actually have multiple affiliates in the metro area, but you just have to check with the local affiliate to see if there are opportunities. And then I would just remind people there are other ways to volunteer other than doing construction. So there are still opportunities to virtually mentor families. There are opportunities to work in the stores. There are opportunities to donate and to advocate and help us on the policy front. So there are. We still love to get people involved, even if right now swinging hammers isn't doable.
Thank you. I want to thank the audience for great questions. Jonathan Reckford, I want to thank you, CEO of Habitat for Humanity. I certainly know a heck of a lot more about Habitat than I did before, and I'm glad to know that it's more than Jimmy Carter building, although I'm always glad to see Jimmy Carter building.
That's a pretty great thing.
Yeah, this has just been terrific. I appreciate it. Everybody, let me tell you what we've got tonight at 5:30. We have a flash briefing, Elections in the Time of COVID, with a Dr. Amy Baxter, political scientist and political analyst, Amy Steigerholt, and a constitutional law professor, Neil Kinkoff. So it's not too late to register tonight at 5:30. I hope you'll join us. On October 15th, we have Peter Baker, New York Times White House correspondent, and Susan Glasser, New Yorker White House correspondent, on their new book, The Man Who Ran Washington, which is about former White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of State James Baker. And October 21st, we have the Ambassador of India, Taranjit Singh Sandhu. We'll be speaking about U.S. and India strengthening our strategic partnership. Be sure and join us for all of those. I want to thank Fernando Lucchini, our Executive Director, and Valerin Lopez de Frank, who is, among other things, both our business manager and the producer for these programs. So thank you both. And I want to thank everybody who was with us today. Jonathan, thanks again. This has just been great.
It's a pleasure. Nice to be with you all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan.
See you all this evening.